I was at my gas pump, filling my own tank on my own property. I wasn't blocking anyone. I wasn't bothering anyone. Then an HOA woman showed up. She said I was required to give her free gas because she was on HOA business. I told her no, calmly, politely. She got angry. She said I was being selfish. She said she'd teach me a lesson. Neighbors started watching. Phones came out. Someone told her to walk away. She didn't listen, so she called the cops. What she didn't know was this: that gas station was mine, the property was mine, and the man she tried to intimidate was the police chief. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from and hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. I was standing at my own fuel pump, filling my vehicle on my own property, doing something I had done countless times before. The afternoon was quiet, the kind of calm that makes you forget how quickly things can turn ugly. I wasn't blocking the road. I wasn't bothering anyone. I wasn't causing a scene. I was simply pumping gas, minding my business, and preparing to head out for the evening. That peace didn't last long. An HOA woman marched up my driveway with purpose, clipboard in hand, heels clicking sharply against the concrete like a warning bell. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask a question. She pointed at the pump and told me I was required to provide her free gas because she was on HOA business. Her tone wasn't a request. It was a demand, delivered with the confidence of someone used to getting their way. I told her no. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I didn't argue. I simply said no and went back to pumping my gas. Her face changed instantly. The polite mask dropped, replaced by anger and disbelief. She said I was selfish. She said I was violating HOA rules. She said she would make sure I regretted refusing her. I calmly told her that this was private property and that she needed to leave. That only made her louder. Neighbors began to notice. Curtains moved. Front doors opened. People stepped outside, curious about the noise. A few of them knew this woman well. She had a reputation. Phones came out. Someone told her to calm down. Someone else reminded her that this was my land. She ignored them all. She said rules were rules and that no one was above them. She said the HOA had authority here. She said she would teach me a lesson I wouldn't forget. Then she pulled out her phone. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think it through. She called the police and loudly reported that I was refusing to comply with HOA enforcement, illegally withholding shared resources, and harassing her while she performed official duties. She spoke just loudly enough for everyone around to hear, making sure the neighbors knew she believed she was about to win. She stood there smiling after she hung up, arms crossed, watching me, like she had already decided the ending of the story. What she didn't know was this: the gas station was mine, the land was mine, and the man she was trying to intimidate was the police chief. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you are watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. I finished pumping my gas slowly, deliberately, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I capped the tank, wiped my hands, and leaned against my truck as if I had all the time in the world. Inside, I could already see where this was going, but I let it play out. Experience had taught me that sometimes the best lesson is letting someone walk straight into their own consequences. She kept talking while we waited. She told the neighbors that I was finally going to get what I deserved. She claimed the HOA would fine me, sue me, and have my operation shut down. She spoke with certainty, as if her authority was absolute. A few neighbors tried again to reason with her, reminding her that calling the police wasn't something to do lightly. She waved them off and told them to mind their own business. The sirens arrived sooner than she expected. 2 patrol cars pulled up at the edge of the property, lights flashing softly but steadily. The HOA woman straightened her posture, smoothed her hair, and rushed toward them like a child running to a parent. She began talking before the officers even closed their doors, pointing at me and repeating her accusations with dramatic flair. One officer approached me while the other stayed back to listen to her version of events. The officer asked for my identification. I nodded, reached into my wallet and handed it over without a word. His eyes scanned the card once, then again. His expression shifted so fast it was almost painful to watch. He looked up at me, then back down at the ID, then straightened his shoulders. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. The HOA woman stopped talking mid-sentence. The officer handed my ID back with both hands and apologized for the inconvenience. The second officer walked over, confused, and asked what was going on. The first officer explained who I was. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a show of it. He simply stated the facts. The HOA woman laughed nervously and Dee said there must be some mistake. There wasn't. The officers turned their attention to her and asked her to explain exactly why she had called the police. As she tried to repeat her story, her confidence unraveled. The authority she had leaned on moments earlier vanished. The officers explained, calmly and clearly, that the HOA had no power over private fuel, private land, or private equipment. They explained that misuse of emergency services was a serious issue. The neighbors kept recording. By the time the officers finished documenting the incident, the HOA woman was no longer smiling. She was quiet, pale, and very aware that her actions had consequences. She was warned, officially and on record, and told to leave the property immediately. She didn't argue this time as she walked away, avoiding everyone's eyes. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, safer. People realized something important that day. Authority only works when it's real, and intimidation only works when people are afraid to stand up. I watched her leave, then thanked the officers and went back inside, knowing this wasn't just about gas or rules. It was about boundaries, respect, and the moment someone learns that power doesn't come from a clipboard, it comes from the truth. After the police cars left and the flashing lights disappeared down the road, the neighborhood stayed unusually quiet. People lingered outside longer than usual, standing in small groups, replaying what they had just witnessed. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Something had shifted. The HOA's usual grip on fear and pressure had cracked, and once people see that, they never forget it. I put my equipment away and went inside for a moment, thinking the situation was finished. I was wrong. Less than an hour later, my phone started buzzing. First one neighbor called, then another. They weren't panicked, but they were uneasy. They told me the HOA woman was going door to door, telling people I had threatened her and that the police had only sided with me because of favoritism. She was trying to regain control of the narrative before it slipped away completely. By the time I stepped back outside, I could already see her at the end of the street, standing with two board members. They weren't yelling this time. They were whispering, pointing, and watching my house like it was a problem they hadn't solved yet. That kind of attention never means anything good. I walked down my driveway calmly. I didn't approach them, but I didn't hide either. If they wanted to talk, they could do it openly. The HOA woman noticed me immediately. Her posture stiffened, and the confidence she had earlier tried to return, but it didn't quite fit anymore. She told me the HOA was scheduling an emergency meeting about my ongoing violations. She said my refusal to cooperate earlier would be documented. She said fines were being discussed. She spoke carefully now, choosing words like weapons instead of shouting them. The board members beside her nodded, but none of them met my eyes. I reminded her that the officers had already explained the law. I reminded her that private property was not subject to HOA seizure or forced use. I reminded her that false police reports had consequences. I didn't threaten her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stated facts. That's when one of the board members finally spoke up. He said maybe this wasn't worth escalating. He said maybe the HOA should consult legal counsel before taking any action. His voice shook slightly, and that told me everything. He knew they were already on thin ice. The HOA woman didn't like that. She snapped at him and accused him of backing down. She said if they let one person defy the HOA, everyone would start doing it. She said control would be lost. The word control hung in the air longer than she realized. A few neighbors had walked closer by now. They weren't filming anymore. They were just watching, listening. The HOA woman noticed them and tried to soften her tone, claiming this was all about community standards. No one responded. Silence can be louder than shouting. Later that evening, emails started circulating, official-looking messages with bold headers and vague legal language. They claimed the HOA was reviewing unauthorized fuel distribution activities. They warned residents not to engage with me regarding shared resources. It was written to scare people, not inform them. It backfired. One neighbor forwarded the email to a local attorney. Another sent it to a city council contact. Someone else replied all and asked where exactly the HOA's authority over private fuel was written. The responses multiplied faster than the HOA could control them. By the next morning, I received a call from the HOA's legal counsel. His tone was polite, cautious, and very different from the woman's. He asked to clarify what had happened the day before. I explained it once, clearly and calmly. I told him exactly what the officers had told her. I told him about the false report. I told him about the threats. There was a long pause on the line. He said the HOA would be reviewing internal procedures. He said no further action would be taken against me. He suggested everyone move forward peacefully. It was the closest thing to an apology I expected. When I hung up, I looked out across the street. Neighbors waved. One gave me a thumbs up. Another nodded with quiet relief. They weren't celebrating. They were reassured. They knew now that intimidation only works until someone stands still and refuses to bend. The HOA woman didn't come by again that day, or the next. Her emails stopped, the board went quiet, meetings were postponed. People started asking questions they'd been too afraid to ask before. And for the first time since the HOA arrived in this neighborhood, the rules stopped feeling heavier than the people living under them. The next few days revealed just how fragile authority becomes when it is built on intimidation instead of law. The HOA tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the neighborhood felt different. Conversations were happening that had never happened before. People were comparing notes, sharing old emails, remembering past incidents they had quietly endured. Once fear loosens its grip, memory gets loud. On the third morning after the incident, I noticed unfamiliar cars parked along the street. They were clean, professional, and out of place. By noon, it became clear why. The HOA board had hired an outside compliance consultant to conduct inspections throughout the neighborhood. Official vests, clipboards, cameras. It was meant to send a message without saying a word. The message was received, just not the way they intended. The inspectors moved methodically, taking photos of fences, measuring distances, peering into yards from the sidewalk. Most residents stayed inside, watching through windows. A few waved politely. Everyone understood this was retaliation dressed up as procedure. The HOA woman from the gas incident wasn't with them, but her influence was obvious. This was her answer. When the inspectors reached my property line, they stopped. They stood there longer than they had anywhere else, whispering to one another, "Che." King maps and documents repeatedly. Finally, one of them approached and asked to speak with me. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The conversation was calm, professional, and short. I asked them to identify the specific authority under which they were inspecting my land. They could not. I asked them if they were aware of the police report filed days earlier. They were not. I told them they were welcome to remain on public space, but they were not permitted to enter or photograph my private property without cause or warrant. I said it clearly and politely. I didn't need to mention my position. The law spoke for itself. They thanked me and backed away. What happened next surprised even me. As the inspectors moved on, two neighbors stepped out of their houses and asked the same questions I had just asked. Another followed, then another. Within minutes, the inspectors were fielding challenges at every stop. Not confrontations, just questions. Calm ones, legal ones. By the time they finished the street, their confidence was gone. That evening, a notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board announcing an emergency meeting scheduled for the following night. Attendance was strongly encouraged. That phrase had been used many times before, usually to rubber stamp decisions already made. This time, people actually planned to attend. The meeting room was full before it officially started. Chairs had to be pulled in from the hallway. The board members sat stiffly at the NT, papers neatly stacked, faces tight. The HOA woman was there, seated slightly apart from the others, her posture rigid. She avoided eye contact. The meeting began with routine language about community harmony and shared responsibility. It sounded rehearsed, forced. When the floor was open for questions, the room changed instantly. Hands went up, voices followed, not shouting, not chaos, just people speaking up. One resident asked about the legality of the inspections. Another asked why police resources had been involved in what turned out to be a private dispute. Someone asked about the HOA's insurance coverage for false reports. That question landed hard. The board hesitated. Papers were shuffled. No one answered directly. Then someone asked about me. They asked why the HOA had attempted to assert control over private property not governed by its bylaws. They asked why escalation had been the first response instead of communication. They asked whether personal grudges were influencing enforcement decisions. The HOA woman finally spoke. She defended her actions, but the confidence wasn't there. She said she had acted in the community's best interest. She said she believed she had authority. She said she felt disrespected. The room didn't react the way she expected. There was no applause, no support, just silence. One board member cleared his throat and said the HOA would be suspending enforcement actions pending legal review. Another added that future complaints would require verification before escalation. The language was careful, but the meaning was clear. Damage control had begun. After the meeting ended, people didn't rush out like they usually did. They stayed, talking in small groups, comparing experiences, sharing quiet relief. A few approached me to thank me, not loudly, not dramatically, but sincerely. They said things like, "I didn't think anyone could say no, and I didn't know we were allowed to question them." That night, I realized something important. This wasn't about me being the police chief. That fact ended one incident, but it wasn't what changed the neighborhood. What changed things was someone refusing to be intimidated, calmly and publicly, and others realizing they could do the same. The HOA still existed, the rules were still there, but the fear was gone. And once fear leaves, control never comes back the same way. The weeks that followed felt like the calm after a storm. But anyone who had lived under the HOA long enough knew better than to assume the danger had passed. The board had gone quiet, enforcement notices had stopped, and the HOA woman who started everything kept a low profile. But silence can be strategic. Power structures rarely collapse all at once. They test the ground first, looking for cracks. Those cracks didn't appear. Instead, something unexpected happened. Neighbors began organizing, not loudly or dramatically, but carefully. People shared documents, bylaws, emails, and old warning letters the EY had saved for years. Patterns emerged: selective enforcement, personal grudges, threats disguised as reminders. Once everything was laid out side by side, it was impossible to ignore. One evening, a small group gathered at my kitchen table. No speeches, no anger, just neighbors comparing notes and asking practical questions. What authority did the HOA actually have? What rights did homeowners retain? What lines had been crossed without anyone noticing at the time? The answers weren't complicated, but fear had kept them buried. As the conversation spread, so did confidence. People started responding to HOA emails with questions instead of compliance. They asked for citations instead of accepting vague threats. They requested written explanations instead of verbal warnings. Each small act made the next one easier. The HOA noticed. A formal letter arrived in everyone's mailbox announcing a restructuring initiative. The language was polished and reassuring, but the intent was clear. They wanted to reassert control by redefining it. Committees were proposed. New procedures were promised. Transparency was suddenly a priority. It was the kind of move organizations make when they realize their authority is slipping. At the next board meeting, attendance doubled again. This time, the board looked tired, not defeated, but strained. The HOA woman was present, but she didn't speak unless directly addressed. When she did, her words were measured, almost cautious. The room no longer belonged to her. A motion was introduced to review past enforcement actions for compliance with state law. Another motion followed to require legal approval before any police involvement going forward. These were not symbolic gestures, they were structural changes. The kind that limit unchecked power. They passed. After the meeting, the HOA's attorney addressed the room. He spoke about cooperation, mutual respect, and learning from mistakes. He avoided specifics, but his message landed. The HOA would continue, but it would not operate the way it had before, not if it wanted to survive. Outside, under the parking lot lights, neighbors talked openly in ways they never had. Some were relieved, some were angry about what they had tolerated for so long. Most were simply glad to feel like residents again instead of subjects. Over the next month, fines were quietly rescinded, warning letters disappeared from records. One board member resigned. Another announced they wouldn't seek re-election. The HOA woman took a leave of absence for personal reasons. No one asked questions. Life settled into something closer to normal. Kids played outside without parents worrying about complaints. People fixed things on their homes without fear of immediate citations. The neighborhood breathed again. One afternoon, as I was walking back up my driveway, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me. He said he had lived there for 12 years and never seen anyone push back successfully. He said it anged how he saw himself, not just the HOA. He thanked me, then added something that stuck with me. He said, "You didn't win because of your title. You won because you didn't flinch." That was the truth. Authority backed by law is powerful, but authority backed by calm certainty is unstoppable. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way. The neighborhood learned it together, and for the first time in a long time, the rules felt like guidelines again, not weapons. By the time the HOA realized how much ground it had lost, the damage was already done. Control, once questioned openly, never fully returns to its original form. The board still existed, the bylaws were still in place, but the unquestioned authority they once relied on was gone. Every decision now faced scrutiny, and every notice had to stand on its own merit. That shift created tension inside the HOA itself. Emails began leaking out, not intentionally, but through careless replies and forwarded messages. Board members disagreed with one another openly. Some wanted to tighten enforcement again, believing firmness would restore order. Others understood that pushing harder would only trigger more resistance. Meetings ran long, votes split, confidence fractured. The HOA woman returned briefly near the end of the month. She attended one meeting and spoke at length about restoring respect for authority. The room listened, but no one nodded. When questions came, they were calm and precise. People asked her to cite exact by laws. They asked her to explain how her previous actions aligned with state law. They asked her why police had been called instead of mediation. She answered none of them clearly. The following week, a notice went out announcing an internal review of conduct. The wording was careful, but the message was unmistakable. Accountability had arrived. Shortly after that, the HOA woman resigned from her position. The announcement cited personal reasons, but no one needed an explanation. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. What followed wasn't chaos, as the HOA had warned for years would happen without strict control. What followed was balance. People still followed rules, but now they understood them. Enforcement became predictable instead of personal. Violations were addressed with communication instead of threats. The neighborhood didn't fall apart, it stabilized. One evening several weeks later, the new board president stopped by my house. Not officially, no clipboard, no paperwork. He thanked me for remaining calm throughout everything. He admitted that fear had been the HOA's default tool for too long. He said the situation forced them to confront that. I told him something simple in return. I said rules only work when people believe they are fair. He nodded like someone hearing something they should have understood long ago. After that, life returned to routine. Not the old routine filled with tension, but a quieter one. I went back to my work. Neighbors went back to theirs. The HOA faded into the background where it belonged, a structure instead of a threat, but the impact lingered. People spoke differently now. They asked questions. They shared information. They no longer assumed authority was always correct. That awareness extended beyond the HOA. It showed up in city meetings, school boards, and neighborhood projects. Confidence is contagious when it replaces fear. One afternoon, I watched kids riding bikes down the street, laughing loudly, unbothered by complaints or warnings. Parents talked in driveways without glancing over their shoulders. The neighborhood felt like a community again, not a monitored zone. I thought back to that day at the gas pump, how ordinary it had felt at first, how quickly it had escalated, how easily it could have ended differently if I had reacted with anger instead of calm. Power feeds on reaction. Starve it, and it weakens. The lesson wasn't about winning, it was about standing firm without becoming what you're pushing against. The HOA learned limits, the neighbors learned their rights, and I was reminded once again that real authority doesn't shout, it stands quietly, waiting for the truth to catch up. Time has a way of revealing what moments cannot. In the months that followed everything that happened, the neighborhood did not just return to normal. It grew into something better, something stronger, something more aware of itself. The HOA still existed on paper, but its shadow no longer stretched across every decision people made in their own homes. Fear had been replaced by understanding, and understanding is much harder to manipulate. The new board operated differently from the start. Meetings were shorter and quieter. Agendas were shared in advance. Questions were answered directly instead of being deflected with vague language. When residents spoke, they were no longer treated as problems to be managed but as people to be heard. It was not perfect, but it was honest. And that alone made all the difference. I noticed the change in small ways at first. Maintenance requests were handled without attitude. Notices were written clearly, citing exact bylaws instead of threatening consequences. Appeals were actually reviewed. The tone of communication shifted from command to cooperation. These were not dramatic victories, but they were lasting ones. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before now exchanged greetings and conversations. People shared advice, helped with repairs, watched each other's homes when someone was away. The sense of isolation that had once kept everyone quiet dissolved. Community returned not because rules forced it, but because trust allowed it. Every so often someone would bring up that day at the gas pump, not in awe, not in excitement, but as a reference point. A reminder. It became the moment people measured things against. If a decision felt wrong, someone would ask, "Is this another gas pump situation?" That question alone kept a lot of bad ideas from moving forward. For me, life settled back into its usual rhythm. I went to work, I handled cases, I dealt with real problems that required real authority and real responsibility. What happened in the neighborhood stayed where it belonged, as part of life, not the center of it. I never asked for special treatment, and I never received it. That was important. Equality under the law is not a slogan, it is a practice. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a family who had recently moved into the neighborhood. They thanked me for helping create an environment where they felt safe and respected. They said they had heard stories about how things used to be and were grateful they arrived after the change. I read the letter twice and then set it aside, feeling something quiet and heavy settle into place. That was when I understood the true impact of what had happened. It was never about proving authority. It was never about humiliation or revenge. It was about drawing a line and refusing to let it be crossed, calmly and clearly, in full view of others who needed to see that it was possible. Courage does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint. The HOA learned a lesson about limits. The board learned a lesson about accountability. The neighborhood learned a lesson about voice. And I was reminded, once again, that leadership is not about standing above people. It is about standing steady when pressure tries to push you down. Years from now, most people will forget the details. Names will fade, emails will be deleted, meetings will blur together, but the feeling will remain. The memory of a moment when intimidation failed and calm prevailed. The memory of a time when rules were challenged not with anger but with truth. And that is how lasting change happens. Not with shouting, not with force, but with someone standing still and saying, clearly and without fear, no, this is where it ends. That was the end of the conflict and the beginning of a better community.